If you follow the quota, like we know many universities are doing, MIT, for example, is one of them who was caught red-handed in executing such gender quotas. If you hire 200 women and 200 men, then obviously you will end up with a pool of women who are not as good as 200 of the best men because of this asymmetry. So, and it's the same applies to hiring people for jobs. Hiring the best woman out there doesn't mean to hire, it's not the same as hiring the best candidate out there.
Right.
And it's very important because science requires really like unique combination of talent, ability, preparation, creativity, and dropping the bar a little bit. It's really dangerous.
Anna Krylov, welcome to Heterodox Out Loud.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to begin just by introducing you to our audience and inviting you to say a few things about yourself. You're the USC Associate's Chair in Natural Sciences and Professor of Chemistry at USC. You are what I think of as a really rare three-tool athlete, rare in the academy. On the one hand, you're a scientific superstar. You're well known, I think best known for the spin flip method. I took a year of college chemistry. I don't know what the spin flip method is. I tried to do some studying on it the last few days. I was like, oh yeah, this is why I was not very good at chemistry, did not become a chemist. But you're a very distinguished scientist. You were elected to the American Academy of Sciences and Letters, I think last year, 2 years ago maybe. You're also, on your second tool, you're also a popularizer of science, bringing it to people, showing the importance of science to young people and just the general population. You've made, I think, at least 2 films that I know of. And you're also, a strong and courageous defender of open inquiry. So we're going to talk about the politicization of science and DEI and the threats to scientific method. I wonder if we could begin our conversation now by just talking a bit about what science is. And I've read a number of your articles. You very eloquently describe what science is. And one of the things you talk about or a couple of things you talk about. You talk about liberal epistemology, and you sometimes talk about the Mertonian method and Mertonian norms. Robert K. Merton, who is a sociologist of science. Can you just tell our listeners, what is science? And do it any way you like. If you want to talk about Mertonian norms, that would be great. If you want to talk about liberal epistemology, just, what is science? How does it, what are the assumptions behind it? What makes it work? Why should we care?
Yeah, I should say with full disclosure that until a few years ago, I wasn't concerned about these fundamental questions about how science works, because I'm, as many other people, is practicing scientist, and most people just learn practice of science by doing it. And things like epistemology and all these principles, we kind of get it by following our mentors and getting immersed in the reality-based community, but we do not think much. And,
sorry, use the phrase getting immersed in the reality-based community.
Yeah, I like this term. Jonathan Rauch wrote this wonderful book, the Constitution of Knowledge, where he describes exactly these concepts in a way that anyone, including a simple nerdy physicist, can understand.
I should tell you that when Jonathan's book came out, John Haidt and I both read it, and we were spending a lot of time just talking about the book. And for a while, John and I would joke that it was like we should make a shrine to Jonathan Rauch and his book in HXA because a little temple that we'd burn candles and incense because it's remarkable.
I would be the first to come to give my respects. So he explains very nicely about how science is actually done, how we get on to agree, how we come to discover truth. And if I can distill the main principles, there are not that many. So the one which, again, taken by granted by practicing scientists is that objective reality exists. It's there, right? It exists, and therefore it can be studied. The second principle is that the truth exists, and it can be discovered and understood. And that claims to truth are open to scrutiny, that comes to the reality-based community, and only those claims that withstand the scrutiny of this community, they become accepted as provisional truth, and that no one has the last word. So everyone can scrutinize claims to truth, revisit the existing paradigms, and that's how science moving along.
And Merton refers to that as organized skepticism.
Correct. Yeah, Merton is also a great intellectual who explains also very clearly what the important principles are. And you mentioned them. They go by the acronym CUDAS, C for communalism, that we share our findings and values, and that's very clearly seen among practicing scientists. Despite the competition, despite the ambition, people share their findings, their results, and that's one of the very important principles that scientists follow. U for universalisms, that the identity of a scientist doesn't matter. So the claims are evaluated by their merit, by how well they describe objective reality, and not by the identity of the scientist, be it identity in terms of prestige, of seniority, or identity in identity politics sense, gender, race, and so on. So this stands for disinterestedness that scientists do not benefit from their findings. And again, some people contest it now and said, well, what about the patents? What about royalties that some scientists get? Well, what about salaries that we get? And so that's all true, but I think it still stands because ultimately scientists do science because they are driven by the desire to understand how the worlds work. So that's really a major drive and major motivation. So, and then, or for organized skepticism, and that, and that is exactly that all ideas are open for scrutiny. There are no ideas that are accepted as sacred truths and beyond criticism. So, and these principles, again, as I said, we do not study them usually in some class or anything like that, but we absorb them and we just follow them as we become scientists.
And Anna, may I just add that what you just described, that process of lack of study on the foundational questions of what science is. You jump into science, you do your chemistry lab when you're a sixth grade kid reading your textbook and then experimenting. Then you just find out you're actually good at it, and you go to Hebrew University and you're recognized as being really good at it. And then you go to Berkeley and they say you're even better than we thought. You're a start. That's a path that most academics kind of experience. And most of us across fields, and this is true in the humanities and in the sciences, we don't study open inquiry. We don't study viewpoint diversity. We don't study constructive disagreement or the methods of these things. We just sort of do them because we love them and we're curious and we're good enough at them to have a career in it. But it's kind of interesting, at a certain point in our careers, many of us at HXA, and you of course as a member, we start thinking, wait a minute, what's this thing we're doing? What's the process itself? I want to mention something too, just to our audience, but also just to you. Before we came on the air, I mentioned to you this essay by Michael Polanyi, The Republic of Science, which is one of my all-time favorite articles, and maybe my favorite article anywhere. I'm not a scientist, but that essay picks up some of those Mertonian points that you were mentioning, especially, I think, perhaps the communalism and the universalism. You may remember, it's probably, you mentioned it's been a while since you looked at that article, but he has this analogy in there. He talks about what scientists do is like a group of people making a puzzle together in full view of each other. And if you think about people making a puzzle spread out on a table, looking at each other, how they're working on it, by watching what you do over there, some scientist or some philosopher, someone working in your discipline, whatever it might be, I can see better what I can do where I am here. And I'm learning from you and you're learning from me. We're all doing this in full view of each other, which is a fundamental condition. It doesn't matter now what your status is, whatever your identity is. It's just can you put pieces together? Are you solving something that interests me? And that affects the things that I'm going to solve too. I just wanted to mention that essay to our listeners. Again, it's called The Republic of Science by Michael Polanyi. It's a great read, and it's a really nice way to get into these more foundational issues. Is there more you want to say about liberal epistemology? I'd like to start talking about some of the challenges to that approach. Should we shift to that now?
Yeah, well, maybe like one more thing about liberal epistemology. I think an important principle, and which sounds for many people as something so trivial that it doesn't even worth mentioning, but as we will move towards attacks on liberal epistemology, we will see that it's also contested by the other side. And this maxim is that knowledge is power. Knowledge is good thing, and we should strive to attain it. And knowledge fundamentally benefits the humanity and drives the technological progress, increases quality of life for everyone, and also ultimately increases empathy and improves and contributes to rise of humanistic ideas, tolerance, and cooperation. So, as you already forewarned, yes. So now we see that all these principles of liberal epistemology, of Mertonian norms in science, are being challenged. And that what was very shocking for me as a practicing scientist, to see how these ideas actually gain traction, because to us it sounds like a complete nonsense and gibberish. And here I will have to read it because I do not want to spoil it. So here are some so some statements that it's not actually paraphrased. It's something that I took notes by listening to a distinguished philosopher of science who is presenting postmodern view on what science is. And she said, knowledge is not power. Those in power control knowledge. And knowledge is used to perpetuate power. So another statement is that there is no objective reality. It just doesn't exist. There are multiple narratives. You tell your narrative, I tell my narrative, and there is no way to say that the one is correct or not. And the biggest part of this is that they say that claims to truth are to be evaluated based on identity of the scientist. So, and we see this, so again, when I heard for the first time this sort of statements, I thought, okay, it's something so crazy, and only people in some philosophy departments can come up with these crazy ideas, and it will never gain traction outside of this little intellectual echo chambers. But I was wrong.
I have to defend philosophy for a moment. I think it began in English departments. Just for the, I just need to say that. Okay. And also, I also want to add, we talked a minute ago about liberal epistemology, And what you're now describing, those quotations that you read, were sometimes described as standpoint epistemology. That in fact, what we know depends on what our narrative is from we see it from our own perspective. And there are many different perspectives, so there's many different realities. That's kind of the background, I think, to some of the points you're just making. But please go on.
Which is like, for a physicist or chemist, it's a crazy idea because, if you go on the rooftop of one of these nice tall buildings that I see in the background and you jump off, you know exactly what happens with you. And it doesn't matter about, your gender identity, your racial background, your social status. The reality is there and it will take care of it. So these ideas, unfortunately, are now not only found their way into science, but some of them are shaping practice of science. And, we can talk about examples of that. So I think it's a very dangerous trend, and it's a big threat to the integrity of science, to the ability of science to do what it's supposed to do. And that worries me a lot. That's what ultimately led me to write these papers that you mentioned that try to.
Well, may I? One of the I think the first essay of yours that I can remember reading was "The Peril of Politicizing Science," 2021, maybe, which is just a fat. I think it was a solo authored piece, as I remember. And then you also have your sort of epic. You and your group of co-authors, an amazing group of co-authors, this essay in defense of merit in science. I think there were 29 or 30 super
29.
Distinguished colleagues, two Nobel Prize winners, also sort of a who's who of HXA, people like Dorian Abbott and Jerry Coyne and Lee Jussum, Glenn Lowry, others we could, but an incredible who's who. Let me just put a label on something. So you were quoting some postmodern conceptions, and sometimes people describe that critique, that school of thought, which means to be challenging liberal epistemology. They describe it as critical social justice. That's going to be now. So critical social justice is making its way from English departments, I believe, into other departments, and now sort of leaping across the two cultures on university campuses into the scientific community. Can you tell us a little bit about how does critical social justice, how has it jumped into science, and where do we see it? What domains of science is critical justice theory influencing?
Yeah, so for me, this critical social justice feels like almost nostalgic, like a deja vu, because it reminds me it's very closely related to the Marxism and all these ideas that were forcibly educated and schooled at our time at Moscow State University. So, and I really, I could go and pull out my old notebooks and refresh my memories about the basic concepts of that. But so it's a mixture of postmodern and Marxist ideas, and it's slightly dusted over, and some terms have changed. But I can summarize its tenets in the context of science as following. So basically, they say everything, including science, is racist, sexist, and colonial. And we heard it in Soviet times that everything is, bourgeois and oppressed. So the existing social inequalities and unequal representations are due to systemic racism and sexism in the present. So that's another tenet, another postulate. So everything they say, including academia, is about power struggle between oppressors and oppressed. So again, we were taught about it since grade school in Russia, that everything about struggle of proletariat and bourgeois. Everything, so practical now we are coming to practical consequences. These ideas, again, following Marx, who was, I think, you probably can correct me because I do not remember the quote verbatim, who said that the job of philosophers used to be to understand the world, but now he says it's time to put it in practice and change the world.
That's right.
Critical
That's
social justice, that's the justice part. They strive to change the world. And in the context of science, they say that everything, including science education, should be dismantled and rebuilt to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion, in quotation marks, because we can talk about what it actually means. And another important practical aspect of this critical social justice is the idea that those who are not with us are against us. And therefore, they must be punished, suppressed, and, we cannot have conversation with them. They are the enemies, and we should dish out, punishment and ultimately get rid of them. So this is a set of ideas of critical social justice, how they manifest themselves in science. And now, unfortunately, we see how these ideas made their way into practice of science, into science policies, and shape such critical domains as scientific publishing. So that's one of the pillars of this constitution of knowledge, scientific publishing. And now we see how it's taken over and severely compromised by these critical social justice ideas. Science funding, again, another critical component of successful scientific enterprise, now taken by these ideas and that are antithetical to the merit-based approach, and that has huge effect in practice of science and what is happening now. And also such important domains like hiring and promoting of scientists and awards and recognition and so on. So I think it's a very dangerous trend, and unless it can be reversed, we will see serious consequences. We already see some of the consequences, I would say, that American science is dropping behind by many metrics, behind China, and losing its preeminence. And I think it's in part due to this change in how it's done.
I want to talk about what the consequences are, but let's just pause for a little bit longer and talk about what exactly. So you sort of listed there are sort of three buckets I think, or areas. There's we could say research, and there's funding, which are these are connected areas, of course, and then there's citations. Can we just say a little bit about? Let's say a little bit more, if we can, about those three different areas, like with publishing. I sometimes increasingly hear people talk about citation justice. What is citation justice in the world of STEM? Has citation justice affected? Can you tell us what it is, and how? And do you see it in the world of STEM in your world?
Yeah, that's because most kind of clear-cut example of how this ideology subverts science. So when we write scientific paper, a typical chemistry paper will have quite a number of references, citations. My papers could have easily like 200 citations, because first you need to, when you write a paper, you need to introduce the topic and explain what is the current state of knowledge. So you cite important original papers of what people achieved in this field, and then also some influential reviews in this field that give a reader a good introduction and background to the field. Then when you make certain claims about your results, you compare it with what other people were doing, so you cite relevant work saying that, this experiment or this calculation came to this conclusion with this data, and here are our data. And they agree, disagree, put additional dimension on it. So there is this aspect. And basically, citations are very important, and they have very specific role, to provide background, to give credit to previous work, and to support new results and claims, and put them in the context of what is known, and where open questions are. Now, citation justice, like in the same, like mindset of critical social justice, that says that, okay, we do not really have pursuit of knowledge, we have power struggle, and knowledge is, scientific practice is a way to perpetuate the oppression and power structures and so on. So they came with this idea that citations are unfair, and that there are epistemologically excluded groups that are not cited with sufficient frequency, and that's our role as scientists is to do justice. And by what they understand justice, it means that not to cite white men, but cite women, racial minorities, gender minorities, and so on. For example, if I write a paper on quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics is put forward, in the 19th century, and obviously most quantum people who developed quantum mechanics were men, with a couple of exceptions, with Maria Curie and Lise Meitner. So basically, these people would say, no, your paper is not gender balanced. You need to go over your citations and find some minoritized, that's their term, scholars, and replace citations. And John, what is funny is there are even software tools for that. And some journals recommend authors voluntarily, completely voluntarily, to run your paper through this automatic tool that will assess gender balance. And they say,
Wow.
well, Anna, your paper is not gender balanced. It doesn't have 50% citation to women. Do something.
But let me just ask you on this now. So you're a woman who came through a very traditionally male field. You don't disagree that there's been some injustice in the past, that there's been exclusion of certain people based on race and gender, for example. Our elite universities in the U.S. have only recently become open to minorities and women, even. So you don't dispute the claim that there's been a history of oppression and exclusion.
Yeah.
But tell us how you think about that, and how this is something different than that.
Yeah, the world was very different quite a short time ago, and I'm big fan of science history, and I read many books that describe paths of women in science, Maria Curie biography or Lise Meitner or others, maybe less famous, but nevertheless important figures. So the world was very different. Women cannot pursue science in many places. Maria Curie had to go and work as a governess for quite a few years to raise some money such that she could go from Poland. Poland and Russia didn't admit women to universities, and to get to study in Sorbonne in Paris, that was admitting women. So I'm old enough to remember the climate in science, which was not very well, I wouldn't say open, but it wasn't encouraging women. Like I told you, how my mother really didn't feel it's a good idea for a woman to go into science because it's just wrong career. And I been in many places, even when I was a postdoc in Berkeley. I was for basically, I think, entirely 2 years, I was the only woman at our group seminars, where there were like a couple of, a dozen plus of postdocs and students. And I was the only one there, and the only one who didn't wear glasses. That made me doubly excluded. So, my senior colleagues who are still working can tell really heartbreaking stories about how women were shortchanged with resources and kind of pushed to the not recognized fully for their merit at my time, when I do not know, like about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. we did have a situation where you would see that you have this discrepancy between in recognition of work by women and discrepancy in terms of conference invitations and awards and so on. So these things existed, they were very real, but we need to stay grounded in the reality and see what is the current situation. And you do not need to take my word for it. Some serious scholars, John Tomasi from Cornell, social psychologist, he looked at the state of women in STEM currently, and he and his co-authors, they carried out detailed study where they pull out all papers, all data from the literature that investigated the existence of biases against women in STEM. So they plowed through all this data and did very careful analysis. And they came to the conclusion that in the past 10 or 20 years, so that's the margin they say, there is no evidence of biases against women in STEM in the following domains: in publications, in grant funding, in recommendation letters, in hiring. In hiring, actually, they show evidence of bias in favor of women, which we know, my experience now confirms that. And the only domain when they found evidence of bias against women is teaching evaluations. So somehow in teaching evaluations they did. So, and that, I think it's a great finding. It's uplifting. It means that, okay, glass ceilings is gone. So,
right.
So it's a great evidence of progress. How far we went as a society, how the situation changed for women. But some people just are not willing to accept it, and they continue to make claims contrary to the reality that somehow we have sexist discrimination against women in the present, right now. And evidence doesn't support it. And then there is additional kind of line of thought, and I hear it very often expressed by sometimes very well-meaning people. They say, well, yes, Anna, so like you said, there was a huge unfairness against women and minorities in the past. Therefore, we need to do something now to redress these past injustices. And to me, it doesn't make any sense. If you start discriminating against men now, it's not going to change anything for this generation of past women that were denied opportunities. We don't have time machine to go back and redress inequalities. And what we do in the present pertains to the present. It doesn't change the past. So we should be grounded in the reality and act accordingly.
May I offer an observation? And I'd love to hear what you think about this. When you talk about injustices towards women, for example, in science, historical injustices, I think your conception of injustice is always tied to the idea of merit. It sounds like as though when you're talking about people not being cited or not given research opportunities or whatever it might be, in every single case, it seemed to me, as I was listening to you, I was thinking there's a baseline you have of merit being what should be. Merit determines what should be. And deviations from merit, at times when merit's not recognized, when women are excluded from labs, for example, or their findings are not taken seriously, or their lectures or their teaching are not evaluated in a fair way. Those are all deviations from the ideal of merit. Is that right?
Yes. Merit in me is grounded in reality, because merit is, how good you are, how good your work is, what your accomplishments are. And that's something that we can evaluate objectively. Maybe it's not, with 100% reliability. There might be some situations when it's difficult to compare two work side by side or two people, but overall merit exists, can be evaluated, because ultimately it's grounded in reality. And deviations from merit, that's what I think what I consider to be injustice and unfairness when people are not evaluated based on their merit.
And so you just added another piece, I think. You just said that merit means connected to reality. And that's interesting because it sort of sets up that contrast that we were talking about a few moments ago. The people who advocate the postmodernist approach that there's not truth, it's all standpoint knowledge, they're skeptical of merit as an ideal, right? So they reject that conception of what they don't identify justice and injustice based on whether merit was recognized or not. They identify justice or injustice with some different criteria. For example, identity politics or some conception of what an equitable arrangement might have been. I wonder if we could dig in a little bit about it, just help us understand about STEM funding and STEM research. How has DEI affected funding? I'm aware that during the Biden administration, there are at least 2 executive orders that had to do with, I think, what they used the word inclusion. I think, unfortunately, but they used the word inclusion, talking about funding, mandating how funding should in science should go. Federal funding, NSF grants, for example, certain Department of Education programs, NEH, National Endowment for Humanities, too. Can you say a little bit about funding in science and how DEI has come into that? What do you see?
Yeah, maybe, John, I will get to it, but maybe can I tell you another short story about
Please do it. Let's do it any way. Let's do it any way you want.
It's a personal story, and which is I wanted to explain my first exposure to the concept of merit, and it happened around the same age when I decided to be a scientist. And in Russian language, we actually do not have the word merit. We do not have the word pluralism, privacy, so many terms just don't exist in Russian. But the concept definitely existed. And after, like my mother scolded me for my idea to be a scientist, and after she saw that I'm persisting with my determination, she came back and sat me down for a serious conversation. So I was like, I do not know, in 7th grade. And she said, look, honey, I know you are ambitious. I see that you're very smart. You want to do what you want to do. You are stubborn. It's all good. But she said, look, seriously, you cannot become a scientist because argument number 1, we do not have connections, she said. We do not have connections in Russian scientific circles, which means that you will have very difficult time to advance. You will be sitting there in the back of the lab, writing theses, PhD theses after one another for sons and daughters of those who have connections. And, you won't be able to. And then she said the second argument is that, well, you need to think about how you are going to provide for your family and what are you going to bring home. And because in Russian economy, like everything was in short supply and money meant nothing. And she said, yeah, like you should go and take a job where you can be closer to some material goods so you can bring some food home or, some textiles or whatever. And what are you going to bring from university, like pens or notebooks? So, and she had very good reason to make these 2 points. And that's when I first time, started to think about this idea of merit versus, all these structures of corruption or nepotism or, social hierarchies that work against merit. And luckily for me, I ended up in a place where meritocracy was at play. Like when I came to Hebrew University, first of all, I didn't speak any language to communicate. So it was quite difficult. But when I get to communicate with my future advisors, we very soon started to write equations. And through that, we established a contact, and he said, I do not know, he said that he was able to see a merit in my preparation and my understanding of mathematics. And I get my foot in the door, I get my chance to advance. So the same applies for subsequent stages of the career. Like in some instances, I had to work maybe harder than others because of difficult start, but what was important that I was judged largely by my merit, and that allowed me to get my job and to advance. So
may I just say that's a fabulous story about your mother. That's just really it's great. But something I'm hearing you say also is that in your experience, entering into a meritocracy at Hebrew University, for example, was for you a way of opening doors. It was meritocracy was an opportunity for you to move through into society into a position that you never could have gone to without a meritocracy. So it's interesting because there's a progressive flag that the defenders of DEI and the postmodern worldview sometimes carry around as they're the vanguard of progress and opening and liberation and so on. But what I'm hearing you say is that in your experience, it was meritocracy, that strict, demanding discipline of excellence, which opened the possibility for you to have the path of life that you've walked.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons I feel so strongly about defending meritocracy. And I'm not alone. You can find many more scientists that can tell you similar stories that came from very modest background, and they get to become what they became because their skills, their talents, their work was recognized, first through standardized tests, then through, their accomplishments and so on. Many Black scholars make the same point, and their careers show the same trajectory. Glenn Lowry, for example, he wrote very eloquently about his life path and how meritocracy helped him to came to this distinguished position from a very difficult start in life. So
as you and I both know, Glenn was the first tenured Black professor of economics at Harvard. And he's told me in part because he was working on equations and difficult problems in economics where it was like, can you do the math or not? And he could do the math. So he just could show them that, which is similar to your experience, I think.
And he moved through the system because in high school, a teacher recognized his talent, and then he was able to get a fellowship, and his path was difficult. He was telling that he had to work a second job to unload train cars at night to make the ends meet. I had to work second job when I was in graduate school, taking cleaning jobs before going to lab to make our ends meet. So it wasn't easy, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that I was judged by the merit. Now, was it fair that I had to do cleaning jobs and some people didn't? I do not know. I think it's an important question. I think it's unproductive to kind of going and trying to ask what was fair, what is fair, and what we should focus on, whether we see fair treatment of people based on their accomplishments. But let's get back to the funding question, because I really think it's one of the most important.
Please. Tell us what you see. Are there just our audience, or most of our audiences are not scientists. Some are, of course, but can you just tell us about what the experience is? Has DEI come into science and funding? What do you see out there?
DEI came into funding in a major way, and I think that's arguably most important domain in the practice of science, because funding is a lifeline for scientists. If you do not have funding, you cannot do your research. You cannot also get your tenure. So in this sense, funding is more important than hiring process itself, because you cannot stay in academia without funding. And American funding system, I thought, was great, especially when compared to other countries, to European countries, to Latin America, to Russia. These countries still struggle in developing a meritocratic funding system. And the systems that they have in place, the biggest problem for these countries is not the lack of funding or lack of resources, but how funds are distributed, how, things are not given by the merit, but by some connection and all that. Now, American science used to operate on meritocratic principles. So proposals were evaluated based on in the very rigorous process of peer reviewing and panels where people look at the validity of proposed ideas, on the quality of preliminary results, if they're there, in potential impact of proposed work, and also on the track record of proposers, what they accomplished before, and
Right.
how qualified they are to do what they are proposing. And of course, also in different funding agencies, one of the people look at how well the proposed work aligns with the mission of the funding agencies. For example, NIH is dedicated to research related to human health. NASA is dedicated to space exploration. Department of Energy is dedicated to energy research, and so on. So, and again, I should say, maybe right away, that the system wasn't perfect. Nothing is ever perfect. So you can hear about stories how some great proposal from a future Nobel laureate was trashed and not funded at some point. So that's all happened. It happened to me. Many people have these examples. Now, but what is important is that on the long run, in bulk, the process worked. And I remember when I was frustrated with my failures with early proposals, my colleague said, look, calm down, do your best next time, and you should know that cream rises to the top. You will get it. So it's frustrating when it doesn't come right away, but people had trust in the system, and I saw myself how it works. So what happens now, and it started gradually, but then, we experienced a sudden change. What we see now is that
can you put dates on? I'm sorry. Can you put some dates on this for us? Like roughly when did you start seeing a change happening in the funding criteria in science? Can you date it?
Maybe there was again some background, things that crippled through that started actually around 90 when I started my work. That was when National Science Foundation introduced what they call broader impact criteria in addition to intellectual merit. And at the time, that sounded like something rather benign and maybe even positive when they say that, we want you to explain how your work benefits society at large. And then, in the beginning, people thought, well, I train workforce, I train graduate students to become expert in this, that benefits the society. Or, my theoretical work can lead to better solar energy, these things. But very soon, because this criterion was very vague, it became more and more a vehicle to implement diversity. And they have now a big part of it is increasing participation, which sounds like, again, also a good thing. There is nothing wrong with increasing participation. But what we see increasingly expected and what people kind of push towards is to implement some identity-based practices in how you hire, how you mentor your students, and how you do the work. So that was kind of slow creep. But then fast kind of change happened around 2022, 2023. And the first thing that really shocked me was we received email from the Department of Energy. The head officer that informed us that starting from 2023, every proposal submitted to Department of Energy And Department of Energy, as I said, that's agency that has very specific mission, promoting energy research, should include peer plans. They call plan for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that this plan will be used as part of proposal evaluation, and proposals that do not have this plan will not be even reviewed, and so on.
And if I may say that, I believe that was a direct result of the two executive orders that I mentioned before.
Correct. Yeah, that was this, and also appointments. The head of DOE was one of the appointees by Biden administration that came from very modest scientific background, but an extensive background in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, the same, like if you look at NASA programs, they now also require this, they call it inclusion plan, which now what is important is, some people, when you talk about these things, they say, well, what's wrong with that? You can write how inclusive your group is, and how you will support everyone equally, and how you will promote people based on their merit and not their identity, and so on. But don't fool yourself. So it's not what they want. And we have plenty of evidence for that. For example, NASA put these multiple documents on their website, PowerPoints prepared to help PIs to understand, the proposers to understand what is expected from these inclusion plans. And they say that, your inclusion plans should demonstrate understanding of systemic barriers and discrimination related to the proposer team. So basically, you cannot say that in our domain, in our little team, we have no barriers and no discrimination. You have to first illustrate the knowledge, so you cannot get out of it easily. Then they want now, NASA, for example, they expect you to put some specific time of your personnel and also some resources for executing these DI activities. Now, even more, they want you to hire external DEI consultants and pay them from the grant that will, consult you and oversee your activities, because obviously, simple chemists cannot be trusted to execute DEI properly. And if you look at NIH have a lot of also very detailed explanations of what they expect to see and what they want to see in the reporting, in proposals. You can also see you can also read the abstracts and sometimes these plans when they're available of funded proposals. So you will see that there is no mistake of what they want you to do and say. So it's not something that makes sense. If you put something that makes sense, your grant will be trashed. So it's
and this is another sphere. What I'm hearing you describe is another sphere where academic or scholarly expertise is displaced by non-experts having a role now in making decisions about, for example, who you hire onto your team, or who you bring into your lab. So it's a displacement of expertise, which is a displacement of merit, yet again.
Some people say that, merit is still at play. We just want to give a head start to minorities. So, and then they
What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's not a valid argument, because let's say if you want to hire, if you have a quota to hire, let's say 50% of women, and you can then select the best women from the pool to fill your quota. But to give you very simple numerical example, let's talk about something simple with large numbers so it's easier to see. If you have engineering school that recruits undergraduate students, and if you have a pool of candidates let's say, 2,000 men and 200 women applying. So if you assume, which is a reasonable assumption, that both pools have about equal distribution of talent and credential and potential, then, if you hire the best people from both pools, just strictly by merit, you will end up with the undergraduate pool that reflects this asymmetry in applicants pool. You will get 20 women and 200 men, let's say. But if you follow the quota, like we know many universities are doing, MIT, for example, is one of them who was caught red-handed in executing such gender quotas. If you hire 200 women and 200 men, then obviously you will end up with a pool of women who are not as good as 200 of the best men, because you did not follow, because of this asymmetry. So, and it's the same applies to hiring people for jobs. Hiring the best woman out there doesn't mean to hire. It's not the same as hiring the best candidate out there.
Right.
Yeah, that's very important, because science requires really the unique combination of talent, ability, preparation, creativity, and dropping the bar a little bit. It's really dangerous. And
We're coming up towards the end of our time. I wonder if you could just say a word more about what you just said about what the social costs are if science progresses a little less quickly, or if a lab does not make the breakthrough that it might have made because it did not have quite the best people there.
mm-hmm.
Can you quantify that? How would you? Do you have a way of thinking about that? What the loss is, what the opportunity cost is, perhaps?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are quite a few consequences to consider. The most immediate one would be all these things that didn't get discovered, vaccines that wasn't developed, or a treatment against deadly disease, or new energy solutions because the lab wasn't staffed by the best people, or because the best proposals weren't funded, and so on. So that's immediate consequences to technology, to society. But there are also maybe broader consequences, and that is that when you see this ideology, DI and the like, injected into science, that causes mistrust. And we already see that trust in higher education and science and institutions is dropping among American public. People do not trust universities anymore. Now, why is it bad? Well, if public loses trust in science, in universities, in scientific research, we are in danger to losing funding for science, because public has a right to say, look, I do not want my tax dollars to be used for advancing DEI or to some crazy projects that I have long list about, like injecting critical race theory into chemistry curriculum or things like that. So it also creates threats for democracy, because if there is a mistrust between people and institutions, that's a recipe for resentment, it's not a good starting point for collaboration between public, legislators, and scientists. So there is also danger of people losing trust in scientific findings. If you read some of these, innate op-eds, so this abstracts of proposals or titles of some proposals dedicated to critical race theory in chemistry, when people look at it, they say, look, you scientists are saying these things. You are saying that there is a unconscious biases everywhere, which is, contrary to what I see as a person or what science says. You tell us about all these things that, there is a continuum of genders, and that sex, biological sex, doesn't matter. So that means that we do not trust you as an expert, as a disinterested and objective expert. You guys are just parts of political game. You are agents who are pursuing some political idea. Therefore, we do not trust you. And that's a fertile ground to all kind of conspiracy theories and losing trust in sound scientific findings, and it's really dangerous for the society. So I think, so there are many reasons to be concerned about this invasion of ideology into science, and I hope very much that scientific community will come together and will fight against them, and will not kind of quietly letting these ideas to spread further.
Thank you. And just to close, you and I could talk about this for hours more, and we will talk about it some more at a conference that you've organized, a really important conference you've organized at USC, Censorship in Science, Censorship in the Sciences, which is this January 10th through 12th, I believe. Could you just tell us a little bit about that conference, just briefly as we close?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank Heterodox Academy for being a generous sponsor and supporter of this conference.
It's our honor.
So
it's our honor.
We appreciate it very much. So the conference is called Censorship in the Sciences, an interdisciplinary perspective. And the idea came from a collaboration among a number of people that resulted in a paper that we published last year, talking about modern censorship. And the focus of the conference is just censorship in the sciences. So we do not talk about censorship in a broader society and or literature or arts. And so what we will discuss, what will be discussed, are examples of censorship in sciences. And we didn't talk about it, but that's another manifestation of ideological invasion into science, when some topics and some findings are considered to be taboo. And when research along some topics is suppressed, and when some scientific findings are censored. And we will have examples of it from life sciences, from climate, from health studies. So
Anna, you've assembled no surprise to us. You've assembled just an amazing superstar cast. Jonathan Rauch, our friend, will be there, who also, by the way, recently became a board member at HXA. Mm-hmm. Can you just mention a few other people who are coming to that conference?
So Greg Lukianov.
A few.
So Greg Lukianov will be there. Jacob Mishigawa will be there. So he wrote extensively about free speech and censorship. Wilfred Riley will be there. So we have scientists, we have philosophers of science, we have social scientists. Corey Clark, Lee Jassim will be there, and they will be talking about kind of studying how censorship operates, the mechanisms of it, social drives, motivation of people. So so it will be 3-day conference, and we will have schedule very soon. So we still have a few open spots. So I would like to see some heterodox people coming in and joining us for this. So I'm very excited about it.
Well, I'll certainly be there. Anna, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for joining me on Heterodox Out Loud.
My pleasure. Thank you, John.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Heterodox Out Loud is a nonprofit production of Heterodox Academy. We rely solely on support of listeners like you. If you enjoyed today's episode, please follow our podcast, leave a rating or a review, and share it with your friends and network. Your support helps us reach more individuals who value diverse perspectives in higher education. If you are in higher education, visit heterodoxacademy.org and join the thousands of professors and students from all around the world who are working to support open inquiry. Until next time, I'm John Tomasi, reminding you that great minds don't always think alike.